Gary Peterson is the professor of environmental sciences at the Stockholm Resilience Center. He has an interdisciplinary background in systems engineering, ecology, and ecological economics from Canada and the US. And he contributed to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and he is currently working to develop quantitative social ecological approaches to the assessment of multiple ecosystem services. And very welcome, Gary.
All right, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be celebrating Gretchen's prize, because it's really a great thing that she really richly deserves. What I'm going to talk a bit about today is a few people have brought up the idea of bundles of ecosystem services, which I'll define what I mean by that in a little bit, and this idea of social ecological systems. So one way of thinking about social ecological systems is to think about the planet. And this is a map from Earl Ellis that's showing the history of intensive use of the world's terrestrial ecosystems. So the point of this map is to say that most of the terrestrial globe, and you could try and make a map like this for the oceans, which would be more recent, has actually not only been dominated by people, but it's actually been dominated by people for a long time. So if we want to understand ecosystem services, we really need to actually be thinking, like Maria was saying, thinking about social ecological services. And what I'm going to argue is that, well, social ecological systems are more complex than ecosystems, in that they have more stuff. So you're including more things in your analysis. It's more complex. However, what does complex system theory say? It says, well, if you have actually a complex system, it's not random, it's not just more complicated. The different things interact with one another. And so actually, by more fully considering the social ecological complexity, I would argue that we actually might be able to simplify our analysis of ecosystem services. So, what do I mean by ecosystem service bundles? Well, by a bundle, I mean a set of ecosystem services. And what I really mean is a bundle is something if the set of ecosystem services are strongly interacting with one another. And this is sort of an empirical question. You can kind of think about if you do something to an ecosystem. So say like Thomas Hahn was mentioning, if there's a system that's paying people to sequester carbon, and you do something to sequester carbon, does that just result in more sequestering of carbon? Or does it change all sorts of other benefits that people want to have from ecosystems? So if it doesn't change anything, that's wonderful. If things are unbundled, you can kind of do all things separately and individually. You don't have to worry about them interacting with one another. However, what ecologists would expect is that different bits of nature and society are all connected to one another. So when you push on one thing, you're expecting to produce results in another thing. So if you enhance one ecosystem service, you can maybe expect enhancement and loss of other ecosystem services. And you can kind of think about this in maybe two simple ways. One is that there's some kind of interaction between ecosystem services. So say, for example, you reduce your ability to regulate floods, and by having more floods, that decreases your amount of crop production because your croplands keep getting flooded. Or, much more likely, there's effects of changes that you make that impact more than one thing. So, for example, you build a dam to produce hydropower, but it also affects carbon sequestration, fish populations, and water quality. And you can kind of think about that these things where there's very little interaction and drivers are all independent, they're likely to be really less bundled. And if things interact a lot, both in terms of ecosystem services and the driver, there's likely to be very bundled. So this is sort of, like I said, an empirical question, but I think ecologists would expect that things are going to be a bit more bundled. And maybe economists would expect things to be less bundled. And this has real consequences for how you treat the world. It's sort of an atomized versus bundled view of ecosystem services. So if everything is atomized, then you can kind of think of things separately from one another. If they're all integrated, you have to try and manage wholes. So if they're more integrated, that means that you do one thing, you're going to affect another ecosystem service that maybe has a whole other set of beneficiaries or people who are affected by it. So it requires some more complex coordination. So as Thomas Hahn was talking about, if everything's atomized, you can maybe market solutions work really great because simple prices can work to do all this. But if they're not, then you need some kind of more complex organization, which could involve government or informal institutions or common property institutions. So I'm going to give an example of where I looked at this, which is a region in Canada, near Quebec, near Montreal, which is called the Montérégie, where you have agricultural land combined with mountains with these old granitic volcanic outcrops, where there's a whole bunch of both high-value agriculture production. That's the center of agriculture production in Quebec. And you have all these kind of cultural landscape represented both historically, the picture of Mont Saint-Hilaire at the top, and a sort of a recreation forested landscape down in the bottom. And we looked at a big area, which is in the sort of shadow of this city of a region of 5 million people that has about 750,000 people living in this region. And we looked at what ecosystem services are produced within a whole bunch of municipalities. So the idea of these municipalities are kind of a unit, which is some social ecological reality, and that these are the lowest levels of government that restrict land use and encourage and discourage certain types of activity. And we looked at a bunch of different types of ecosystem services, a bunch of provisioning ones, a bunch of regulating ones, and a bunch of cultural ones. And as Maria mentioned, of course, these aren't pure categories. Something like deer hunting in Quebec is basically a cultural activity, but people still eat the meat, so it's partly provisioning. And you could maybe argue that your summer cottage is something that is giving you cultural values, but it could also be an investment. So if we look at these services across the landscape, we see that they have very different patterns across the landscape. And there's some similarities, but basically all of them are unique. But if we look at correlations between them, we find that there's basically some strong patterns of interaction. That basically intensive agriculture is negatively correlated with, positively correlated in blue with crops and pig production with each other, but negatively correlated with everything else. And a whole bunch of other ecosystem services, both cultural and regulating, are positively correlated with one another. So this says, well, there's some structure there. And we could use this structure to identify bundles, so saying that there were some reality. If we look at all these different municipalities, you can cluster them into some types. And we chose 6 because this is a reasonable level, but you could do it with 2 or 4 or 7. And this captures a lot of the variation in the landscape. So this is showing the sort of 6 that we identified. And you can map these to regions in the landscape that correspond to some social ecological regions. So saying that there's some areas that have a lot of agricultural production with lower water quality, with not so much maybe tourism or cultural values. There are other areas which have a mix of all of these things. And there's other areas that are they're sort of more these amenity landscapes where there's very little intensive agricultural production and lots of sort of recreation. So this is saying, if we look in this landscape, you can argue that these aren't sort of pure bundles and that they're not the exactly same unique sets at different places of the landscape, but there's a consistent there's at least some degree of bundling of these ecosystem services, that you find higher values of ecosystem services together or apart. So you could say, well, what explains this pattern? So one of the things that a lot of ecologists have focused on is people have used land cover to try and predict ecosystem services. But if you're taking a social ecological approach, even though land cover is something that is produced by people in nature, you can kind of break it up. So we looked at sort of some geographic factors, some social factors, and ecological factors, and tried to see how well these predict ecosystem services on the landscape. So this is trying to say, what's producing these patterns? And what we can find, which is coincides with what a lot of other people find, there's very little skill in predicting ecosystem services that aren't directly related to land cover. So basically, if you want to predict ecosystem services, the best thing to use is land cover, but it's not very good. And it only really works with things that are really related to land cover. So for example, crop production or forest recreation. And this is sort of a complicated table, but this is sort of showing how well a whole zillions of models work to predict different, statistical models work to predict different ecosystem services. And the point being here is how well different drivers across the top did is they each did well at predicting some ecosystem services, but none of them worked well at predicting all of them. And the services they could explain varied a lot. And you had some things that were explained well, but a lot of things that weren't explained very well, even with these kind of complicated models. So you could say, each variable contributed to explaining some of the distribution, but an individual ecosystem service could be predicted by a few variables, but different variables for all of them. So this is saying that, well, if you just look like things like this, it's very complicated. But so another approach is to try and say, well, what if we try and just predict where these bundles are? So this is sort of a simpler approach, saying, well, if we think of the sort of the average values of these bundles and we try to predict where different types of socio-ecological systems or bundles are in the landscape, how well do we do in looking at the pattern we saw of individual ecosystem services? So I use something called a classification regression tree analysis, basically some statistics to say, looking at 3 different socio-ecological variables of land cover, altitude, and distance from Montreal to predict what type of ecosystem service bundles you had. And this predicted 5 of the 6 bundles. It missed the tourism in the way I did it, but it actually works out here. This is showing in the colors, showing the prediction of different ecosystem services, showing you actually get a better prediction than predicting the services individually with much less variables. And there's sort of a systematic type of error here. The map up there is showing where the blue is good prediction and red is bad. And basically what that's showing is that the tourism activities around these little Montérégie hills, these little mountains, are not predicted because the model doesn't do well and doesn't predict that land class. So what this is saying is by kind of considering this social ecological complexity at this place, it makes a lot more sense to understand the landscape. And I would argue, at least from not presenting this, but talking to the people in the region, thinking about you have this type of landscape that produces a whole bunch of different ecosystem services, a lot more easy to talk and argue about than thinking about each of these services individually. However, a lot of the ways that policy works and scientists do research, they're looking at things like pollination ecosystem services, or the most famous one is REDD, which is this potential for billions of dollars to pay for carbon sequestration around the world, where they're not considering all the effects on these multiple ecosystem services or what are the social factors that maintain them. So to summarize this, like I was saying, this kind of approach works well overall, but has some systematic errors, but they're kind of predictable errors. And it also highlights that if you want to understand stuff, it's really useful to combine the social, the geographic, and the sort of more ecological variables together. And together, those predict your ecosystem services better than just either looking at the social or the ecological alone. And one of the things maybe, I sort of have a background in geography as well, I guess, is I think this kind of spatial explicitness is actually something that's very important, and this very much relates to cities as well, that you often see this type of pattern around cities of very predictable land uses. And managing and thinking about that is, I think, a really useful way of using ecological services in a complex way. So what at least the results of this research suggest that it's really important to focus on the management of these bundles and thinking about, well, how you move from one type of one bundle to another. Maybe also think, are there certain places that are producing these bundles better or worse than others? But also that these kind of maybe simplistic market-based approaches that aren't ignoring the spatial embeddedness of both the ecosystems and the social processes that are producing them are not very good ways of enhancing the supply of ecosystem services. This doesn't mean that they're useless or anything, but just that they maybe shouldn't be applied so naively, because this suggests that there is a need for a lot of coordination among these different costs and benefits of practices to enhance individual ecosystem services. So this is one case. Is this true in other parts of the world? I don't really know. We're working around Stockholm to try and do a kind of direct comparison to see if it is true, but I expect it is at least somewhat true. So I'd just like to, since I'm the last talk, is going to wrap up with what I see, and this sort of echoes both what Gretchen said and a little bit like what Maria said of what I think of what are the challenges for ecosystem services science in social ecological systems. One is that people have repeatedly mentioned the benefits that people get from nature, but this is something where we really are quite weak on what are really the benefits to human well-being that we get from nature. So people know a lot about production services, or like the value of agricultural production. We know quite a lot actually about some cultural services, particularly those associated with tourism and property values, but we know very little about sense of place, health, and how these things change and vary over time. And this partly is because we don't really know that much about human well-being. if I'm sure people read the paper, know there's a big boom of interest in both governments and statisticians and health researchers to try and get a better sense of how to actually think about well-being and how to do this in contexts as different as, say, working in Burkina Faso to Stockholm, and what are the different aspects that we need to understand and how these vary over time. This is a really big challenge and requires a lot of connection to not just social science, but also to psychology and the medical sciences. Secondly, slightly different from what other people have said before, if we know that we want to have certain types of ecosystems, we don't really know how to engineer ecosystems, how to design, engineer, and manage ecosystems to produce things that we want. And especially if we think about we're living in this human-dominated planet, which we're, whether we want to or not, is going to continue to transform for the next century due to our modifications to the atmosphere and Earth's biogeochemical cycles. We need to better understand to not just have the ecosystems that we have or will have, but to try how we can get the ecosystems that we want. And this requires connecting more to both architects, designers, and engineers, not just sort of the usual set of social or economists and ecologists. Third, understanding ecosystem services. A lot of this work I presented, most of the work that we do, is really looking at snapshots of stuff in time. It's really looking at equilibrium values, but often ecosystem services are most important in terms of dealing with shocks, as Åsa mentioned about how green spaces were really important during the Second World War in Stockholm, providing a capacity to innovate and adapt. And to try and think of it, if you have surprises, how do you understand what are the factors that maintain and give you the ability to do novel things in ecosystems? And finally, a key challenge that I think has been touched on a lot is that ecosystem services often do stuff at different scales. So you have a place, it's fixing carbon that benefits everybody in the world, it's providing habitat for wildlife that range over a wide region, it's providing pollination for a smaller region, it's maybe providing some special values for the person who lives right next there. There are all these different scales that are coming together. And in general, we have these big problems of how we understand and manage across these scales. But this is a real challenge for us as sort of social ecological researcher or as humanity, is how to kind of all live together in some practical and effective way. So I'll just wrap up by saying that the work I presented was done with my colleagues, my former student, Kira Rautza-Pern, colleague at the Resilience Center, Elena Gordon, colleague at McGill University, Elena Bennett, and funded by a bunch of places. And if you want to find more, there's some addresses there. So thanks very much.